This episode of The Trail Went Cold is brought to you by Casper, an online retailer of premium mattresses for a fraction of the price, because everyone deserves a great night's sleep. Get $50 off any mattress purchase by visiting casper.com/cold and enter the promo code COLD. That's casper.com/cold and the promo code is COLD. Thank you and enjoy the show. January 6, 1982. Breckenridge, Colorado. 29-year-old Bobby Oberholzer phones her husband to say she is going to spend the evening drinking with friends. Bobby never returns home and is found shot to death the following day. An orange sock which does not belong to Bobby is found at the murder scene, and 6 months later, it is linked to the body of a 21-year-old murdered woman named Annette Schnee. It appears that both victims were shot to death on the same night by the same perpetrator at different locations. For years, Bobby's husband is considered a possible suspect, but even after he is cleared, there are still no answers about who actually committed the orange sock murders. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we will be featuring one of the most memorable cases ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1982 murders of Bobby Oberholzer and Annette Schnee, aka the Orange Sock Murders. There's a reason I chose to cover this particular case now. Over the past few months, seasons of Unsolved Mysteries have been gradually added to Amazon Prime, and we're extremely grateful for that. However, some of the original segments which aired during these seasons are conspicuously missing. Apparently, some segments could not be uploaded to Amazon Prime for legal reasons, but since the majority of those cases have been solved, that does make sense. However, when Season 4 was uploaded last month, there was one glaring omission: the Orange Sock Murder segment. Given that this is still an active cold case involving the murder of two women which has gone unsolved for 35 years, I have no idea why they decided not to include this one. But it's a pretty iconic Unsolved Mystery segment, and there's a lot of interesting info about it which wasn't included on the show, so I thought it only appropriate that it be featured on The Trail Went Cold. It's a pretty horrifying and frightening mystery because it involves a killer who was so brazen that he murdered two different women at two different locations, at different times, on the exact same night. The reason this case is known as the Orange Sock Murders is because an orange sock belonging to one of the victims was found at the murder scene of the second victim, definitively proving that the same perpetrator was responsible for both crimes. I should provide a brief shout-out to the website RockyMountainColdCase.com, which extensively chronicles this case, and even features photographs of the actual pieces of evidence, including the infamous orange sock. It is maintained by Charlie McCormick, a private investigator who has worked on this case for a long time and really wants to see it solved. But before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it and leave us a rating or review, because that will help us garner more exposure. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on our website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. We have a pair of new donors this week, including Sherry, who sent us a very generous donation, and Kathleen, who has signed up to become a recurring monthly donor, so a huge thanks to both of you. And we also need to send out a special thanks to the very talented Esther Gomez. As you might recall, Esther drew us some cover art for our 1-year anniversary show, and we loved her work so much that we brought her back to do the cover art for this week's episode, and it looks amazing. So thank you once again, Esther, and be sure to check out some of her other artwork by clicking on the links to her Facebook and Tumblr pages in our episode description. And we have another special announcement to make. You probably know that I will be appearing at CrimeCon this year at the JW Marriott Hotel in Indianapolis from June 9th to the 11th, and that the Trail Went Cold will be represented on Podcast Row. Well, during the month of April, CrimeCon held a contest called a Private Party Giveaway to see which podcast had the most listeners order tickets by entering their specialized promo code to earn a 20% discount. Well, guess what? The Trail Went Cold has won the contest, so anyone who used that promo code is now invited to join me at a private party hosted by CrimeCon. They are going to supply the space and an hour of open bar to thank us for all our support. And I'm already dreaming up some very special surprises for you wonderful fans at this get-together, and I'm really looking forward to hanging out with you. I have still not received exact details from them about when this party will take place, but once I do, I will share everything with you on the podcast and on social media. Now, like I said, if you ordered tickets by using the Trail Went Cold special promo code, they already have you on file and you are guaranteed a spot at this party. However, if you want to attend CrimeCon and you still have not ordered tickets yet, you can still enter our special promo code TTWC20 in order to get a 20% discount and earn yourself a spot at our private party. Once again, the code is TTWC20. I will release more details as they become available, and I cannot wait to see you there. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the Orange Sock Murders. Our story begins in 1982 in Breckenridge, Colorado, a ski resort town located in the Rocky Mountains. One of our victims is 29-year-old Barbara Jo Oberholzer, who goes by the name Bobby. Bobby lives in the nearby town of Alma with her husband Jeff Oberholzer, whom she has been married to for 4.5 years. Bobby works as a receptionist in Breckenridge. Jeff runs his own appliance repair business, and the couple are making plans to start having children. After finishing work on the evening of January 6th, a bitterly cold night where temperatures fell to 20 below zero, Bobby telephones Jeff at 6:20 to tell him she received a promotion. She wants to go out and have drinks at a local pub with a couple she knew in order to celebrate. Jeff asks his wife if she needs him to come pick her up, but Bobby says she'll get her own ride home. Believe it or not, during this time period, it was a very common practice for Bobby and many of the other residents from the area to use hitchhiking as an everyday form of transportation. Bobby had hitchhiked to work that very morning and would possibly hitchhike home that night if need be. Anyway, while Bobby was out, a friend of Jeff's named Joe Urban stopped by the Oberholzer home. Jeff and Joe went to a nearby gas station where Jeff bought some gas for his friend and a 6-pack of beer from a nearby liquor store shortly before 7 o'clock. They then returned to the Oberholzer home for a little while to drink beer and watch television until Joe left at around 8 o'clock. Shortly thereafter, Jeff fell asleep and woke up at around midnight, but was surprised to discover that Bobby had not arrived home yet. Jeff started to become really concerned when 2 a.m. passed and Bobby still hadn't returned because that's the time the bars closed. When Jeff contacted the couple Bobby was having drinks with, they told him they had wanted to stay out late, but Bobby just wanted to get home, so she left the pub at around 7:50. Another one of Bobby's friends would later recall offering her a ride, but she turned him down when he said he was only going as far as the town of Blue River, which was still several miles away from her home. So Jeff went out and drove around through Breckenridge to look for his wife, but he could find no trace of her. He tried to file a missing persons report with the police, but they told him she would have to be missing for a certain amount of time before they could do so. When morning hit, Jeff received a phone call from a rancher who lived 30 miles outside of Breckenridge. He claimed he'd found Bobby's driver's license on his property and was calling after looking up her name in the phone book. So 2 of Jeff's friends picked him up to drive him to the ranch, but while driving there on Highway 285, Jeff noticed a blue object in the middle of a snowy field. Remembering that Bobby's backpack was blue, Jeff asked his friends to pull over to check it out, and sure enough, it did turn out to be Bobby's backpack. Resting beside it were some tissues and one of Bobby's gloves, which both had blood on them. Even after Jeff took these items to the police, they still wouldn't file an official missing persons report for Bobby since the necessary waiting period had still not passed, and they told Jeff she probably had just run off. So Jeff and his friends were forced to organize their own search effort, and by 3 p.m., they would discover Bobby's body. She was found on an embankment at the summit of a scenic overlook called Hoosier Pass, located next to Highway 9, about 10 miles south of Breckenridge. The location was situated between Breckenridge and Bobby's home in Alma, and over 15 miles from the field where her backpack was found. Bobby had been shot twice with a medium-caliber revolver and died from hypothermia and blood loss. Curiously, the only footprints at the scene belonged to her. A pair of plastic wire ties were found around one of Bobby's wrists, so the evidence seemed to suggest that someone was making an attempt to abduct Bobby before she made a run for it and the assailant shot her. However, the most baffling discovery at the scene was an orange sock, which did not belong to Bobby. But believe it or not, this would not be the only case in the area involving a missing woman. That same day, police received word that another local resident, 21-year-old Annette Schnee, had disappeared on the evening of January 6th. Annette worked a day job as a maid at a Holiday Inn in the nearby town of Frisco, and also had a night job as a cocktail waitress at a bar in Breckenridge. The last reported sighting of her took place in Breckenridge at around 4:45 p.m. when she was seen leaving a pharmacy. At the time, Annette was having a conversation with a dark-haired woman, but she has never been identified. Like Bobby, Annette pretty much made hitchhiking a part of her daily routine, as she frequently thumbed rides to and from work. On the evening of the 6th, Annette was scheduled to start her shift at the bar at 8 p.m., but she never showed up. Her work uniform was found at her cabin in nearby Blue River, so it seemed like she was planning to hitchhike home to pick up her uniform before heading to the bar, but she never made it there. Unlike Bobby, Annette could not be found anywhere, and it would be nearly 6 months before there were any answers about what happened to her. On July 3rd, her body was discovered in Sacramento Creek, next to a remote dead-end side road located over 20 miles south of Breckenridge. Like Bobby, Annette had been shot by a medium-caliber revolver. She was shot once in the back, but the bullet passed right through and was never found. Annette was wearing a striped sock over her right foot, and the other striped sock was in her sweatshirt pocket. But the most incredible discovery was that she was also wearing an orange booty sock on her left foot. It soon became clear that Annette was the owner of the matching orange sock found at Bobby's murder scene. Since their bodies were found 13 miles apart, this seemed to indicate that both women were murdered at different times on the same night by the exact same perpetrator. While Bobby and Annette were both young, attractive women with long shoulder-length hair, there was no indication that they knew each other, so the scenario suggested the crimes were committed by an opportunistic predator who possibly picked both of them up hitchhiking. It seemed likely that Annette was killed first after being picked up in Breckenridge during the early portion of the evening on January 6th, before the perpetrator returned to Breckenridge, picked up Bobby, and killed her as well. Police had a theory for why Annette's orange sock wound up at Bobby's murder scene. Annette was fully clothed, and the state of decomposition on her body made it impossible to determine if she had been raped. However, her clothing seemed to be in a state of disarray, as her shirt was inside out, and one of her striped socks was in her pocket. This suggested that either her body had been redressed, or Annette had gotten dressed in a hurry after being sexually assaulted. If the assault took place in that remote area inside the perpetrator's vehicle, Annette may have attempted to make a run for it before she was shot. In the confusion, one of her orange booty socks may have been left behind in the vehicle. Later that night, the killer picked up Bobby and had plans to sexually assault her as well. Since Bobby had plastic wire ties around one of her wrists, the evidence suggested that the perpetrator tried to subdue her, but Bobby fought him off and tried to escape before she was shot. The killer probably shot her from a distance, which would explain why no other footprints besides Bobby's were found in the snow. During her escape attempt, Bobby may have inadvertently knocked Annette's orange sock out of the perpetrator's vehicle. The killer subsequently drove off and then disposed of Bobby's backpack and driver's license at different locations. It's also worth noting that 2 months after her body was discovered, Annette's backpack was found in close proximity to where Bobby was murdered. It contained a photograph of a man with a crew cut, and to this day, he has never been identified. There was also another surprising discovery in Annette's backpack. Her wallet contained a business card for Jeff Oberholzer's appliance repair business. Right from the outset, police had looked at Jeff as a possible suspect. Since he just happened to come across Bobby's backpack in the remote field, this put the idea into their heads that he might have been responsible for his wife's murder. When Annette Schnee was reported missing, police questioned Jeff and asked him if he knew her, to which he answered no. However, a few days later, Jeff came forward and claimed that he saw Annette's photo in the newspaper and actually recognized her. Apparently, sometime before she was murdered, Jeff had picked up Annette hitchhiking in Blue River and given her a ride to her job in Frisco, because, like I said earlier, this was all just a normal everyday routine in that area. They conversed, and Jeff remembered giving Annette a card for his appliance repair business, but after that, he claimed they never interacted again. So by the time Annette's body was found, there was already a logical explanation for Jeff's business card being in her wallet. In spite of the suspicions against him, Jeff fully cooperated with investigators and passed a polygraph test. However, they couldn't rule him out as a suspect because of issues with his alibi. Jeff maintained that aside from the brief visit he took to the gas station with his friend Joe Urban, he was at home all evening, and that Joe could verify being with him during the time period when Bobby's murder likely took place. However, Joe no longer lived in the area, and because he had gone through some tough financial times, it seemed Joe had become something of a drifter. Investigators just could not track Joe down to question him and get him to verify Jeff's alibi. Believe it or not, they did not find Joe at all until December of 1990. He finally confirmed that he did visit Jeff's house on the night of the murders, but the times he provided were not an exact match to the times Jeff provided, so Jeff could still not be completely ruled out as a suspect. Well, thankfully, Jeff now had a resource at his disposal which wasn't available back in 1982: DNA testing. It was initially assumed that the blood evidence found on Bobby's glove and the tissues in the field belonged to her, but DNA testing showed that it actually belonged to a male donor. It's believed that when Bobby's abductor attempted to tie her up, she put up a very strong fight and likely drew blood from her attacker by punching him in the nose. So Jeff submitted his DNA to be tested against the blood evidence, and it excluded him. So a full decade after the murder of his wife, Jeff was officially cleared as a suspect. Unfortunately, while it was nice that Jeff was finally vindicated, this only brought the investigation back to square one. Even though they turned up a couple of strong suspects, whom I'll talk about momentarily, the DNA evidence did not match them, and thus far, it has failed to match anyone. In 2006, the case got back into the spotlight again when it was profiled on Sensing Murder, a TV show where psychics visit famous murder scenes and attempt to use their powers to solve the crime. I normally don't put much stock into what psychics say, but they actually came up with a fairly interesting theory, which I'll discuss in a little while. Anyway, the case still does get media coverage every now and then, and there is enough solid evidence to prosecute a suspect should he ever be found. But unfortunately, the Orange Sock murders still remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Before we continue, let's take a brief moment to talk about Casper. The Trail Went Cold is very grateful to have Casper sponsoring this episode. This podcast often shares some very scary stories which could potentially keep you up at night. So that's why it's very important to have the right mattress on hand to make it easier to get a great night's sleep. Well, Casper is an online retailer of premium mattresses for a fraction of the cost. They are revolutionizing the mattress industry by cutting the cost of dealing with resellers and showrooms and passing that savings directly to the customer. Casper's mattress is an obsessively engineered mattress at a very fair price. The mattresses are made of supportive memory foams for a sleep surface with just the right sink and just the right bounce. In fact, the Casper mattress meets the Goldilocks standard of just right because it's not too hard and not too soft. Plus, its breathable design sleeps cool to help you regulate your temperature through the night. So if our podcast is causing you some restless nights, try sleeping on a Casper mattress. You can buy it easily online and completely risk-free. Casper understands the importance of truly trying out a mattress that you technically spend a third of your life on. Casper offers free delivery and painless returns within a 100-day period. Wow, yes, that's right, 100 days. And you don't even have to lie down in a showroom, which is a good thing, since statistically, lying on a bed in a showroom has no correlation as to whether or not it is the right bed for you. Casper's mattresses are made in the USA, and they offer free shipping and returns to both the US and Canada. And since The Trail Went Cold is responsible for keeping you awake at night with our creepy stories, it's only right that our listeners receive a special offer. So you guys can save an additional $50 towards a mattress purchase by going to casper.com/cold and entering the promo code COLD. That's casper.com/cold and the promo code is COLD. Terms and conditions apply. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of this episode. Well, I'm sure the one aspect of this story which sounds very unusual today is the constant hitchhiking. Nowadays, we all know how dangerous hitchhiking can be, but this is one of those cases which showed everyone how dangerous it really is. It was just a different time back in 1982. Breckenridge and the surrounding area were considered to be a safe community and not known for violent crime. It sounds like hitchhiking was such a routine daily occurrence that motorists would expect to see people like Bobby Oberholzer and Annette Schnee holding out their thumbs for a ride to work, and were more than happy to pull over and give them a lift. That explains how Jeff Oberholzer and Annette just happened to cross paths months before the murders. I'm sure Bobby and Annette got to know some of these motorists so well that they were perfectly comfortable climbing into a vehicle with them. But sadly, on the evening of January 6, 1982, both women just happened to accept a ride from the wrong person. And of course, after these murders, hitchhiking around Breckenridge almost came to a complete stop. It's pretty shocking to imagine just how brazen this killer must have been to commit 2 separate murders like this on the same night. Given the amount of risk involved, it's easy to believe that Bobby and Annette were not the perpetrator's first victims, and it's also possible that more than one person was involved. The one thing which is certain is that this doesn't seem like the type of crime which would be committed by a mild-mannered individual like Jeff Oberholzer. It's really hard not to feel immense sympathy for Jeff here, as not only did he lose his wife, but he had to live with the stigma of being accused of double murder for a decade. Unsolved Mysteries featured its fair share of people who were suspected of being responsible for the murder or disappearance of their spouse, and a lot of the time, they came off really badly in their interviews, and it wasn't hard to imagine them being guilty. But Jeff Oberholzer was definitely not one of those people. The Unsolved Mysteries segment was filmed before Jeff was officially cleared by the DNA testing, but just from watching his interview, it was hard to imagine him being responsible for this crime. Jeff came off as a genuinely nice, down-to-earth, soft-spoken guy, and sounded really sincere when he mentioned how much he missed Bobby. And even if he had issues with his wife, What motive would he have to kill another woman on the same night? It sounds like Jeff was the victim of extremely bad luck and some very unfortunate coincidences. He happened to notice Bobby's backpack in a field before her body was discovered. He gave Annette Schnee a ride and gave her his business card months before she was murdered. And his alibi witness, Joe Urban, just happened to go off the grid for several years. If you were to look at all these things on paper, you can see why Jeff might be considered a strong suspect. And after initially denying that he knew Annette, Jeff made a very wise move by coming forward after recognizing her photo. If police had found Jeff's business card without him volunteering that information beforehand, then who knows how badly Jeff might have been railroaded. Because let's face it, even with those coincidences, it sounds like investigators did develop a case of tunnel vision and spent too much time focusing on Jeff rather than pursuing other leads. Believe it or not, one person who added a lot of fuel to the fire was Jeff's own brother, Jamie. This case was featured in a book called Murderers Among Us, and Jamie was actually quoted as saying, "I can't prove it. All the evidence is what you would call circumstantial, but I believe he killed her." Jamie and his wife even spread rumors that Jeff was a womanizer and once took a swing at Bobby shortly before the murders. However, Jeff denied these allegations, and no one else ever reported any serious issues in the Oberholzers' marriage. According to Jeff, Jamie always had a crush on Bobby and was jealous that he got to marry her instead. So when Bobby turned up dead, Jamie seemingly pointed his finger at Jeff out of spite. And Jamie's wife claimed that she was visited by a spirit named Mr. Death, who wanted vengeance over Jeff murdering Bobby. So this should give you a pretty good idea how credible these people are. Nonetheless, the police hounded Jeff for years, and all these accusations took a toll on his reputation in the community. His appliance repair business went under, and he was forced to find work as a plumber. And if the investigators ever saw Jeff having a conversation with another woman, they'd be sure to let her know that he was a suspect in the murder of his wife. And then when Joe Urban finally surfaced to corroborate Jeff's story, he provided a different set of times he was with him, which did not entirely match Jeff's story. Though really, how could you expect a guy to accurately remember a thing like that after nearly 9 years? So thank God Jeff's name was finally cleared when DNA testing proved that the blood on Bobby's glove was not his. Now, I'm soon going to be discussing the possibility of these murders being committed by multiple people, so you might be wondering, how do we know Jeff didn't have an accomplice? And that's a valid question, since Jeff's alibi witness, Joe Urban, just seemed to disappear for the next 9 years. Even though the blood evidence doesn't match Jeff, maybe it actually belongs to Joe, and the two of them committed this crime together. Well, if you look at the timeline of this case, you'll see just how absurd this idea is. Annette Schnee was last seen in Breckenridge at around 4:45, and we know for sure that Jeff was at his home in Alma at 6:20, since he received a phone call from Bobby. So in the span of about 90 minutes, Jeff would have to pick up Annette from Breckenridge, drive 20 miles to the remote road near Sacramento Creek to murder her and dump her body, and then drive back home in time to receive the phone call from Bobby. That's certainly not impossible, but seems pretty risky, since Jeff could not have known ahead of time that his wife was going to go out drinking and wouldn't be coming home straight from work. It's also clearly established that Jeff and Joe Urban were seen at a gas station and liquor store together shortly before 7 o'clock, so if Jeff had an accomplice in these crimes, it really couldn't be anybody else but Joe. So a few hours after murdering Annette, Jeff and Joe then drive back to Breckenridge to pick up Bobby, even though she told him she was getting a ride from someone else. Remember, this was the pre-cell phone era, so how could Jeff even be certain he'd find her? Jeff and Joe then pick Bobby up and try to subdue her. Bobby fights back and punches Joe, getting his blood on her glove, so they decide to shoot her. Even though Jeff's home is only a couple of miles south from where the murder took place, he decides to drive over 20 miles out of his way on Highway 285 to dispose of Bobby's backpack and driver's license at different locations, and he lets Joe, the guy he's relying on to be his alibi witness, just skip town. And Jeff does all this even though he has no motive whatsoever to murder his wife, to say nothing of Annette Schnee. Once you think over the circumstances of how these crimes were carried out, It just makes so little sense for Jeff to have done this. So now that the book is closed on Jeff Oberholzer, let's look at other suspects, of which there are a few. One possibility is notorious serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, who once bragged that he had murdered a woman in Colorado in 1982. But as you might already be aware, Lucas probably holds the all-time record for confessing to murders that he didn't commit, so I'm not sure I'd put much stock into him. However, it is interesting to note that Lucas was actually convicted of the murder of a Jane Doe in Georgetown, Texas in 1979. Since the victim could not be identified, she was nicknamed Orange Socks, because that was the only garment of clothing she was wearing when her body was found. I doubt that's anything more than a coincidence, but I do find it interesting that Henry Lee Lucas has been tied to 2 separate murders involving orange socks. There are 2 stronger suspects in this case. One of them is a guy named Thomas Edward Luther, who committed a horrific crime in Breckenridge just 1 month after the orange sock murders. In February of 1982, Luther picked up a young female hitchhiker named Mary Brown and proceeded to rape her and beat her with a claw hammer. The victim survived the attack, so Luther was arrested and charged with rape and attempted murder. While he was in jail awaiting trial, Luther allegedly bragged to multiple people about being responsible for the murders of Bobby Oberholzer and Annette Schnee, and it's worth noting that Mary Brown had a resemblance to both women. When questioned, Luther denied these allegations, but he failed 2 lie detector tests. Luther also made his living as a cab driver, but his company's records showed that he wasn't working on the night of the orange sock murders. However, investigators never found any hard evidence to tie Luther to the crime. Anyway, Luther served his time for the attack on Mary Brown and was released, but in 1993 he murdered a woman named Cher Elder and received a 48-year sentence. On paper, Luther seemed like the perfect suspect, but like Jeff Oberholzer, DNA testing excluded Luther as the source of the blood on Bobby's glove. The other major suspect is a guy named Tracy Petrocelli, who shot his fiancée to death in Seattle in October of 1981, and then went on a 6-month cross-country murder spree which involved him traveling through several states, including Colorado. Petrocelli came up on the radar as a candidate in the orange sock murders because at one point during this time period, he mentioned staying at the same Holiday Inn in Frisco where Annette Schnee worked. Petrocelli is currently on death row in Nevada for his crimes, but DNA testing has also excluded him as the source of the blood from Bobby Oberholzer's glove. In spite of this, however, neither Luther nor Petrocelli have been completely ruled out as suspects, because investigators have not eliminated the possibility that one of them could have committed the orange sock murders with an unknown accomplice, who could have been the real source of the blood. In Petrocelli's case, at least, that idea isn't too far-fetched. During his murder spree, Petrocelli had a habit of picking up men, convincing them to commit robberies with him, and then killing his accomplices once they served their purpose. In Thornton, Colorado, Petrocelli and an unidentified male accomplice test drove a vehicle from a car dealership before the accomplice shot the salesman and they took off. The salesman survived the shooting, but even after Petrocelli was apprehended, his accomplice was never found, so it seems likely that Petrocelli killed him at some point and disposed of his body. Since Thornton is less than 2 hours away from Breckenridge, is it possible that Petrocelli and his unknown male accomplice could have committed the orange sock murders together, and this accomplice is the real source of the blood evidence? While I wouldn't rule out the possibility of multiple people being responsible for this crime, because abducting and murdering 2 different women at separate times on the same night would be a daunting task for just one man, I think the odds of Luther having an accomplice are slim since he always seemed to work alone and he committed the attack on Mary Brown by himself. I wouldn't completely rule out Petrocelli committing these crimes with an accomplice, but really, the only thing that links him to the murders is that Petrocelli once claimed that he stayed at the Holiday Inn where Annette Schnee worked, which is a tenuous connection at best. However, I mentioned earlier that this case was profiled on an episode of the TV show Sensing Murder, in which 2 psychics put forward an altogether different theory involving 2 perpetrators. Now, I'm usually a huge skeptic when it comes to psychics interjecting themselves into these cases, but I gotta admit, Their theory here is kind of intriguing. They believe that one man was responsible for raping and murdering Annette Schnee, and that he did so at a different location than where she was found. This man had an accomplice who was present for the murder, but did not actually participate. The two men then worked together to dump Annette's body in Sacramento Creek. This accomplice apparently got such a high from the whole experience that he ventured out into Breckenridge on his own later that same night. He drove the same vehicle used to dispose of Annette's body, and he proceeded to abduct and murder Bobby Oberholzer. And of course, Annette's orange sock was left behind in this vehicle, but fell out at Bobby's murder scene. So essentially, each woman was killed by a different man, but they were acquainted, and both of them were present for Annette's murder. The psychics even named these suspects, though both their names were bleeped out during the episode. One of these men was apparently killed during an attempted bank robbery, but the other one was still alive at the time the episode was filmed. Yeah, on the surface this theory does sound contrived and absurd, but here's why I don't completely discount it. The psychics claimed that the man who killed Bobby was infatuated with her, and that witnessing his male companion assault and murder Annette was the motivating force he needed to attempt the same thing with Bobby. Jeff Oberholzer has always believed that his wife was killed by someone she knew. Even though it was a common practice for Bobby to hitchhike, Jeff didn't think she would have gotten into a vehicle with a stranger that night. The reason Bobby left the bar was because her friends wanted to stay longer and make a night out of it, while she just wanted to get home. She knew that if she called Jeff for a ride, he would come pick her up. So why wouldn't she have just done that instead of going out to hitchhike on a freezing cold night where it was 20 below zero? This is why Jeff thinks that his wife might have bumped into someone she knew who offered her a ride, but then abducted and murdered her. So what if this was a person who'd known Bobby for a while and now wanted to use this opportunity to take advantage of her? Another point which does support the psychic's theory about two different perpetrators is that the actual bullet used to shoot Annette was never found. So while we know that Annette and Bobby were both killed by a medium caliber revolver, we can't be 100% certain that it was the same gun. So this would lend a bit of credence to the idea that Annette was murdered at a different location than where she was found. So we've talked quite a bit about the Oberholzers, but we haven't really delved too much into Annette Schnee's background. As far as I know, she didn't have any known enemies with a motive to kill her. But of course she was a very beautiful young woman, so she would have been an ideal target for an opportunistic predator, especially if she was hitchhiking at night. So there is good reason to believe that she was just selected at random to be a victim. However, there are two big unanswered questions regarding Annette, which may be nothing more than red herrings, but are still very strange. Number 1. Who was the unidentified woman seen speaking with Annette at the pharmacy right before she disappeared? Annette was overheard reminding this woman to buy cigarettes, so it sounds like they were conversing in a way which seemed to suggest that they knew each other and weren't just two strangers who crossed paths in a public place. Yet even though a composite sketch of this woman was released publicly, she never came forward, and none of Annette's family, friends, or acquaintances has any idea who she is. The woman was also described as looking like she had been camping out for a few days, so she may have just been visiting the area and left town after the murders. It's most likely this woman has no connection to the crime, yet it's so odd to me that she was the last known person to speak with Annette while she was alive, but has not been identified for over 35 years. So the second big question is, who was the man in the photograph found in Annette's backpack? Like the woman from the pharmacy, no one from Annette's life seems to have any idea who this guy is. It could be nothing more than a red herring, but it is a pretty unflattering photo of an ominous-looking dude, and it almost looks like his right eye is swollen shut. Because of his crew cut, the guy looks like he could be military, and the photo also resembles a mugshot. So why exactly would Annette have something like this in her possession? I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say this guy's the killer, as I doubt he would leave a photograph of himself in his victim's backpack, but it's yet another odd detail in a very odd case. So overall, I'm really not sure who could be responsible for the Orange Sock murders. I mean, there are a ton of intriguing suspects and theories, but I can't get 100% behind any of them. Thomas Edward Luther just seemed like the perfect suspect, but the DNA didn't match him, nor did it match Tracy Petrocelli. The idea presented on Sensing Murder that each woman was killed by a different man is also intriguing. But I don't know, my gut tells me that both murders were committed by the same person or persons. I just have the feeling that something about the murder of Annette Schnee left the killer feeling very unfulfilled, so he decided to do it again, and went on to kill Bobby Oberholzer that same night. Whoever was responsible, I just have a feeling that this wasn't the first murder this particular perpetrator committed, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't their last either. I know there's been a lot of speculation that Bobby was murdered by someone she knew, but I'm not entirely sure. This would be easier to believe if Annette hadn't been killed first, but unless the particular theory presented by the psychics is correct, I don't know why someone who was fixated on Bobby would commit a second murder. I guess Annette's murder could have been some sort of practice run, and she was chosen because she was hitchhiking and vulnerable, and she happened to bear a resemblance to Bobby. However, I do think we might have had more answers if the investigators hadn't developed tunnel vision about Jeff Oberholzer. Given the circumstances, I certainly don't blame them for focusing on Jeff as a suspect. But the issue is that they became so fixated and spent so much time hounding him that they didn't explore other options, so they very well could have let some important leads slip through their fingers. Jeff was interviewed on the Sensing Murder episode, and even though he has since gotten remarried, you can tell that he still loves and misses Bobby and really wants to find out who killed her. Considering how brazen this killer was, the best case scenario is that he has since been incarcerated for another unrelated crime, but we'd all like to find out for sure, and finally provide some closure on this horrifying case. So if you have any information about who was responsible for the murders of Bobby Oberholzer or Annette Schnee, please contact the Eagle County Crime Stoppers at 970-328-7007. That's 970-328-7007. If you'd like to learn more information about this case, please visit the website RockyMountainColdCase.com, which is a very comprehensive archive for material about the Orange Sock murders. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I'd like to thank all my fellow Unsolved Mysteries fans, especially those from the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. I also want to send out a big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and of course a major shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the creepy music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.